This is your urgent call to action. We are all called to lead in a world in chaos, crisis, and turmoil. Join a pivotal global movement for change to transform the leadership crisis worldwide. Will you play it safe, or will you wake up, step up, and speak out? Like Nelson Mandela did for South Africa and the world, we need a radical new way to think, act, and lead, leading boldly into the future. Join host Anne Pratt, a Harvard Fellow and multi-awarded businesswoman, and unlock the best version of yourself to revolutionize leadership with what the world needs now.
Greetings to all you future bold leaders. Thank you for joining us from around the world. My name is Anne Pratt, formerly from South Africa, and relocated abroad to attend a Harvard Leadership Fellowship in Boston, Massachusetts, in the United States of America. Our bold leader today joins us from the beautiful ocean state of Rhode Island in the United States of America. He spent around 20 years in the private sector in research and development, working for IBM before transitioning into academia, initially as professor of engineering and later to become vice chancellor of the prestigious University of Cambridge in the United Kingdom. He has served since 2004 in the House of Lords in the UK Parliament and is the former president of the Royal Academy of Engineering in the United Kingdom and member of multiple academies of engineering in China, Australia, the United Kingdom, and the United States of America. Stay with us as we explore his remarkable journey, how he helped the University of Cambridge transition from a focus of pure academic excellence to one that blended that with building bridges into the private sector and working with technology companies around the world. His own transformational leadership experience, learning to relate in a different and new way with women in the workplace, and his many special moments with Nelson Mandela and also with the late Duke of Edinburgh. We warmly welcome Professor Lord Alec Broers, who has humbly suggested and requested I call him Alec during our conversation today. Welcome to Leading Boldly into the Future. It's such an honor, a privilege to be with you today. Thank you so much for coming on to this conversation, and thank you for being with us.
It's a pleasure.
I thought a great place to begin. I know you've had such an interesting, diverse career. You spent 19 years with IBM. You spent quite a lot of time in research and development. You went on to become a professor and vice chancellor of Cambridge University in the United Kingdom. And of course, you've served in the House of Lords since 2004. And apart from that, you have many global positions, you know, in the world of engineering, serving for various academies of engineering in China, Australia, and of course, president of the Royal Academy of Engineering in the United Kingdom. So I was wondering, given this a career that has converged in many ways, what really stands out in terms of leadership in the world today? And what are the biggest challenges facing leaders, given this very multifaceted background and career that you've had?
As an engineer, I think the biggest challenge is to harness engineering to tackle the complexity. These problems that we face, climate change, these are highly complex matters, and they can't be solved by sort of hand waving and dreaming. It's going to be a lot of hard graft. It's going to be a lot of technical stuff. It's going to be a bunch of compromises, and there's no silver bullets lying around. And the problem is, in my mind, that we've got to harness the brightest in the world to this problem.
Yes.
And in many countries of the world, you don't have to worry about that, because in China, for example, there is politics, of course, but so many of their leaders are engineers.
Yes.
I mean, I'm, as you know, a member of their academy, and I went and spoke on behalf of the world's universities at the celebration in the Great Hall of the People for the new millennium. Person who leads off always when it comes to technical matters are the engineers. Then the scientists come, and then the rest come. We need that focus.
Yes.
We need, of course, the political focus. And one of the issues we have in a lot of places in the world is we've got to persuade more people who have the knowledge and the training of engineers more than anybody else to also become effective politicians. We give up too soon in trying to explain the complexities of problems and sort of go off on our own and try to solve them. But these problems, we have to bring everybody along with us.
And just out of interest, I mean, you have done that so deftly. I mean, serving in the House of Lords, clearly you're very astute in taking these complex technical engineering issues. What would you say to those up and coming engineers, first and foremost, and of course scientists as well, and multiple stakeholders? What would you say to those people around the different aspects of leadership that they need to harness?
I'm famous. I've been ridiculed by the Daily Mail, amongst others, for this, once with a headline that says, when I was head of engineering in Cambridge, Professor Broers wants his students to go dancing. What I said to them was that if you're going to be of influence in the world, you've got to learn how other people think and what they do. And so the easiest way to do that is to get a variety of interests that are away from your own personal technical engineering interest. So if you're a member of the theatre and the acting society, be Juliet, one of the heroes of a play, and don't just do the lights. Get yourself sports or play a musical instrument or do something on the other side, because that will not only broaden your view, it'll make you a little more interesting to other people. Then you have to make some sacrifices, because to be effective, I'm not good at really getting in there, having lunch and having a beer with everybody and talking football or whatever you have to do to influence a broad spectrum of people, which politicians have to do. But it's a bit difficult to train yourself when you've been trying to discipline yourself to concentrate on a specific issue, to resolve a very difficult issue, to then turn yourself into a more gregarious, sort of broad-minded person. You can't just say we want more engineers in Parliament. What we need is people who are broad and specifically understand more on the technical side.
Yeah.
And where people cite that example all the time, because in Britain, you tend to be ridiculed if you can't remember the key characters in a Shakespeare play. But if you don't understand how a car operates, you almost boast about it. It's an unsolved issue in an awful lot of countries.
Yes.
Places like France have been a little bit clever because their Grands Écoles are primarily engineering schools. The Chinese are naturally that way. The Germans are quite that way. We always regard the apprentice route to being an engineer as being the sort of the lower route, and perhaps it can catch up with the professional engineers. In Germany, that's not the case. They start at the same level.
Yes.
And they proceed in slightly different ways. Mm-hmm. So you look on the board of Bosch or Siemens or someone, you'll find them almost in equal numbers.
So given that, these different kind of cultural approaches, which approach do you think is most relevant in dealing with our current challenges around climate change, for example?
Well, you've got to try to take the best and bring them all together. But I think, the UK is very good at media issues, at presenting things. I mean, that can be combined. So you need that from the UK. You need the enthusiasm and drive of the Americans that is unequaled almost anywhere. Then you need the style of the French engineers, who are always very interesting. Look around the countries of the world, and you can select those characteristics, I think, and then try and encourage young people. I mean, my mission has been just to try to encourage young people to see engineering as a creative, people-orientated activity, which is not the way most people see it. And correctly so. I mean, engineers are famous. One of our oldest jokes is where do you find engineering in the telephone book? And the answer is just look for boring.
So I guess to your point, how do we accomplish that in terms of shaping these future leaders that have these incredibly important engineering and technical capabilities, but also being able to galvanize people, to influence, etc.?
There's no single best way to lead. You've got to adapt your leadership to the environment you're in.
Absolutely.
And it will be completely different in different environments. And it's like giving lectures, recognizing when you're just preaching to your own choir and when you're trying to convert people.
Yes.
And look at your audience all the time.
Yes, absolutely.
Count the number of people who are walking out the back door. Those who are sitting with their arms firmly.
Could you share with us a practical, concrete example from your own career background where you've had a big challenge to face, either in your time, at Cambridge University or even in the House of Lords, but perhaps at Cambridge in education? Take us back in time. What was it? How did you feel at the time? What was the context?
What I'd choose is when I became Vice Chancellor. I didn't go back to Cambridge to be Vice Chancellor. I was in America for IBM, working for IBM for 20 years. I then moved back to Cambridge because I was quite senior in IBM, and I didn't want to spend all my time managing, which is what I was doing. I wanted to go back to my research. I felt I was better at that than I would have been at managing. So I was back at Cambridge for about 10 years. And however, by mid-90s, the university had reviewed the administration of the university, and they decided to change it. The university is governed by the Regent House. The Regent House is the governing body of the university. It's the most democratic system you will find. It consists of most of the academic and academic-related staff of the university's departments and colleges. It currently has 3,000 members. In my day, if I received a letter with the signature of 10 out of the 3,000 members disagreeing with a decision that the council, the elected councillor, tried to put before the university, we had to hold a referendum of the university, of the 3,000 Regent House.
Wow.
This was not very practical.
Sure.
It had to be changed. That was my best weapon for trying to change this. But
okay.
A lot of members of the Regent House did not think that was a good idea. They liked this because it gave the, how would you like to be in an electorate of 3,000, but be given the power of only being one of 10 people? And if you look at a university body, look at any group of 3,000 people, let alone ones that are brilliant and very high intellect, you'll find, a few who have come off the rails. Mm-hmm. So there were always about 5 who were having a dispute with the university about their position or whatever, and would vote against anything that the university wanted to do. So you only had to have another 5, and we had a problem. So that was one thing that really needed to be changed. Being Vice Chancellor is not like almost any other position. Nominally, the Vice Chancellor of the University of Cambridge, boosting in some people's mind, is formally known as the Right Worshipful Vice Chancellor. The Duke once turned to me when he was the Chancellor of the Duke of Edinburgh and said, "You're not worshipful, let alone right worshipful."
Yes.
But the Vice Chancellor is the main administrative officer of the university, and today is elected by the Regent House for a term of up to 7 years.
Okay.
But it's the Regent House that has the ultimate authority. The day-to-day administration is carried out by the council. Mm-hmm. For over 500 years, up until 1992, the term of office of the Vice Chancellor was limited to 1 or 2 years, mm-hmm. and the position was part-time. This ensured the university that this person could never really get a grasp of the job. The position only became full-time in 92 as a result of a recommendation of a committee called together to review the administration of the university. However, it took a long time. At the time, David Williams, who was my predecessor as Vice Chancellor, was coming to the end of a 2-year part-time term. And because they didn't manage to set up the procedure for a sort of international search for a vice chancellor, it was decided, as he was doing a good job, that he should just continue for another 5 years and do the position. He came to the end of his 7 years in 96, and a committee had been formed to go out and search. But for reasons I don't know, they never found anybody who had applied for the job that they seemed to want to appoint. So they came to me. I had not applied for the position because I'd gone back to Cambridge to do research.
Yeah.
And the last thing I really wanted to do was to step into another administrative job, let alone one that was huge in breadth and very small in authority.
Yeah.
You know, as some of my predecessors and what I used to say, as Vice Chancellor of Cambridge, I have the power to both smile and frown. The only thing I don't have any power over is whether anybody's looking at me while I do that.
Yeah.
So at any rate, they approached me, and the chairman of the committee was somebody called David Harrison, who was a very good friend of mine. He had been head of the vice chancellors and principals in the UK. He'd been vice chancellor of Exeter University, a man of immense experience. And he asked me to go and talk to him. I went to talk to him, and he said, "I'm afraid we haven't found anybody." I asked him that we're really enthusiastic about. And I said, "Goodness me, what are you going to do then?" And he said, "Well, I've been asked to talk to you to see if you would consider taking the position." And I said, "Well, David, you know, I came back to Cambridge to do research. And besides that, I was fundamentally an industrial researcher. I'm not an academic." And he said, "Well, the committee seems to think that your combination of experiences might be useful to the university at the time." I said, "Well, the only thing I could do perhaps would be to try and advocate for the university a more outward looking position, embracing more in the technical subject industry and in everything else, the world at large." And
Which was a big transformation for the university, if I recall. I mean, it had been very academically more inward focused around academia. So that would have been a major transformation strategy for Cambridge.
Well, it was a mixture. It was a mixture because, Cambridge was famous for its cluster of businesses around and the science parks. So they've been doing a lot of this. I mean, they were already on the way, but there was a core of people, the more traditional academics in the more traditional subjects, who would look around and say, why should we change? We seem to be leading in most of our subjects. We've certainly won more Nobel Prizes than anywhere else in the world. And therefore, if it ain't broke, don't change it. I knew I couldn't be bombastic about this thing. I didn't have a lot of powers to operate. So I had to go very slowly. But at the same time, I thought, well, I'd better make my position known. Otherwise, people won't know where I'm coming from. So when I took up the position, I organized, with the suggestion of a few of my senior staff and others, a lunch afterwards, and invited all the industrial and other leaders and media people we could find in Britain to Cambridge.
Okay.
And I gave a speech that was formally titled Building Bridges, and to also show that I was a person, if not of considerable breadth, at least some breadth, because I was a singer and other things. I arranged for the first and last time that an opera imposed by Sandy Gurr, who was the professor of music in Cambridge, a performance of his opera in the Senate House. After that, the town and everybody decided that there were too many people in the Senate House and it was a far risk. It should never be done before, but it was a pretty outstanding success. And,
how did that shift the conversation? How did that?
It shifted the conversation. Nobody knew quite what they were getting.
Yeah.
But I was very well aware that there were enough who were considerably nervous about having this person. I was seeking a lot of activities, but I wanted to make sure that I was broad. I think the engineers may have been somewhat disappointed because the last thing I was going to start pushing was engineering.
Yeah.
I really wanted to work with the arts and humanities.
Yes.
I was also very enthusiastic about a proposal that came along for an institute called CRASH, which was a center for research in the arts, social sciences, and humanities.
Yeah.
And that was a success, a huge success.
Mm-hmm.
I did almost nothing except, show some enthusiasm. We changed fundraising because I was enthusiastic about the United States in particular.
Yes.
And so we had to change our United States group of Friends of Cambridge, who were more a dining society who enjoyed dining with the Vice Chancellor if he visited America than they were down-to-earth fundraisers. So we changed that and formed something called Cambridge in America. Then we managed, in a fundraising effort, we expanded the number of people in the United States, and we decided to look for a scholarship scheme because we were jealous of Oxford's Rhodes Scholars.
Mm-hmm.
And that was when we got lucky, and through some of the talented fundraisers and that, we found our way into the Gates Foundation. And I had met Bill Gates in my own sort of field. At least he's a software person and I'm a microelectronics person.
Yeah.
But in the end, after a lot of, again, rather difficult negotiation, we came up with the Gates Cambridge Scholarship Scheme, for which their foundation gave a magnificently generous $220 million.
Mm-hmm. What took that, Alec? What enabled you to persuade them to make that transition?
Cambridge wouldn't make the, we compromised. The fundraising thing was, I won't go back there. That happened really before my time, but I'd been asked to be a member of their fundraising group because to a lot of dons, this was an awful idea. The idea of asking people for money in a sort of begging way was abhorrent to them. It's sort of inherently abhorrent. But we changed that. A whole lot of people in Cambridge shops, not myself. Another thing we did, I worked with Herman Hauser and David Cleaveley, who are the two. Herman was the doyen really of the entrepreneurs, and Cleaveley another. We formed something called the Cambridge Network. And we were determined that when we came to America, people wouldn't always assume when we were talking about Cambridge that we were talking about Massachusetts. The reaction, as one man said, when he was about to land a deal for a company, and when asked where he was, he said, well, I'm in Cambridge. And the person said, well, we don't really mind working with the East Coast.
Yeah.
So he then said, no, this is the old Cambridge, where it's a potential investor sat back in his chair and said, gee, that was terrible what happened to Diana. Their vision of the UK was not a cutting edge technical approach, which Cambridge had had for years. I mean, knowledgeable people knew Cambridge was really very strong at that sort of thing. Absolutely. We wanted a broader. So we formed the Cambridge Network, which embraced all of the companies outside around Cambridge and companies all over the world if we could. So
that was part of the transformation strategy in terms of
this
shifting.
was all part of a gradual transformation. And then Gordon Brown wanted MIT to come to Britain and set up a university. And because we knew people at MIT, I got involved in that, and we came up in the end with something called the Cambridge MIT program. And the Chancellor of the Exchequer in the UK gave us another 200 million to do that.
Fantastic.
And so here was the broadening of the outlook. One silly little anecdote I'd tell you is that it was a bit like Obama being given the Peace Prize, the Nobel Peace Prize. In a certain extent, premature, a difficult thing. The Cambridge Evening News, which was the local newspaper, and a very active university with the university, named me Businessman of the Year. To which
you were Vice Chancellor?
Yes.
Oh, wow.
I said, that's not necessarily helpful in this bit of leadership I'm trying to do. It cemented in some people's mind that this Vice Chancellor isn't a real academic.
Did that particular branding, did that work for you or against you in trying to move the university?
It worked for me for those who are setting up small companies in the university and wanted to expand and do all the rest of it. For the pure academics who didn't agree with all this external stuff and thought it was all a matter of intellect and talent and that we'd done fine without any of this stuff in the past. Why do we need more of this stuff? It confirmed in their minds that I was going in the wrong direction, probably.
So what was the final outcome? I mean, you know, at the end of that transition.
It was a mixed bag because we put proposals. I mean, everybody, I presume, Crash was a success. The Cambridge MIT program was difficult. It went on, it produced a lot of very good research output. We exchanged students, but getting two universities to work on equal basis together was sort of difficult, but it expanded the horizon. It was very useful to me to, as a transatlantic spirit level, to see which were the really good faculties and world class in Cambridge and in MIT. And it was amazing because some of the ones, the faculties that thought they were top of the world, MIT really didn't want to work with, and others who weren't so highly regarded, MIT really wanted to work. That was a mixed one. The fundraising in America was now, I think, reasonably popular because the people might have worried a little bit about it, but it was bringing resources into the university. But when we tried to change the organization of the university to increase the number of votes required to call into question and call for a referendum, as it were, was increased. We proposed that. We proposed that there be 5 pro-vice chancellors, rather than just 2, to assist the vice chancellor and therefore make the leadership more effective.
Okay.
We wanted external membership on the council, not just members of the university.
And was that approved?
That in the end, but we had to have 2 goes at it. The first lot, a lot of these things were voted down.
Yeah.
In the end, we got them all through. But it was not easy, any of that. I didn't want to be too prominent in any of that.
Yes.
All the reorganization was under the chairmanship of somebody else, one of the senior academics. All of these major things, the reforms were all with other academics. If you think you've got to do everything because you're better than it's other people that are going to do things for you. Not if you want to pull off something significant, you can't do it yourself.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And you certainly made some pretty significant, you know, changes. And I guess part of the leadership lesson is that, you know, sometimes one has to take this through in bits and pieces. I mean, and, you know, if you don't succeed the first time, you know, you go back again. Changing tack slightly, I know during your wonderful life, you've had the great privilege of meeting Nelson Mandela, I think on 2 or 3 occasions. Could you take us back to a moment in time when that stands out again? Where were you? What was the situation, you know, and what impact did he make?
He was always a role model for so many people, but especially for him, with him. I met him in several different contexts, completely different contexts. Well, I only really met him in person twice, I think, but I was in and around him at other times.
Yes.
But they came at about the same time. Well, I think it was first, I met him in the context of the Peace Parks project that he was doing with Anton Rupert. And I had been on the board of Vodafone, and I chaired the charity that Vodafone had that it set up, and I chaired it as the academic on the board. And we made that an international charity. And one of the things we chose to give quite a lot of money, £1 or £2 million to, was this Peace Park project, because we had contacts in South Africa as well.
Can you briefly tell us what that project, the goal of that project?
The Peace Park project was something that Nelson Mandela and Anton Rupert got together to do, to build nature parks, sort of like the Kruger, where
Kruger National Park,
where you could go and look at animals in their natural environment, but to do it on the borders between two countries.
Mm-hmm.
And the first one that was, I think, quite a success was on the border between Mozambique and South Africa.
Yeah.
And to set up those parks with a whole lot of sort of small hostels or hotels on them that the local people could work in. Mm-hmm. So you got quite a lot of employment generated.
Yeah.
So you would have those where, perhaps with 12 rooms or something for guests, and you'd have a number of those over the park. So you provided employment for the locals and a whole sort of build up of business. Okay. And then tourists would come in and you'd look after them and you'd take them around in a very carefully considered way to look at the animals in their natural environment, and the animals would be trained not to be troubled. And it was amazing. Mary and I were invited out and we spent 2 or 3 days on this one between South Africa and Mozambique. And we saw how when you were in a Land Rover, one of these tiered things, the animals took no notice of you.
Yeah. Well, you were lucky,
Alex. I was going for a walk, and I had to go for a walk with one of the rangers, who, if that's what they're called, who had to be a marksman, and he took a big rifle in case he ran into the wrong animal at the wrong time.
Yeah, well, you were lucky, and absolutely. But that's
Mandela was very keen to take the demilitarized zone between the Koreas. That was one of his aims. I don't know whether that's ever been done. In fact, there were all of this. It was quite difficult, this project. I think it was an absolutely wonderful idea. I haven't really followed it recently. There were problems because the lions in Mozambique had tuberculosis. And there was a problem that you didn't want too many coming across the board if they had that sort of problem. But I went there and we went and stayed at Anton Rupert's house. And then there was a dinner in Cape Town that Nelson came to, Madiba, as he's always called by them, to that dinner.
Yes.
And there was a slight mistake made at the dinner because at that stage he was getting quite frail and was not prepared to climb the 2 or 3 stairs, sets of stairs to get up to the upper level where they were going to hold the dinner. Yeah. So he declined and he said, I really can't do that. So he spoke to everybody downstairs.
Yeah.
But the thing I saw then was, it was that combination. I mean, I don't know how you generate it. It's charisma in a way, but that immense dignity that he carried. But the thing that all impressed me was the human and low-key way in which he did things. He didn't give a great bombastic speeches, and it was not. Yes. The voice was filled with authority, but it was not a loud voice. And so many politicians around the world have to shout at you all the time. That just was not his way of doing things. But the second time was when, well, initially he was given a series of honorary degrees by a whole lot of universities at Buckingham Palace.
Yes.
But that was a huge event and a lot of people there. It was an excellent way, and I think really showed, as I think you've pointed out to me when we were talking the other day, the Queen's special liking and relationship with Mandela.
Yes.
And it was a way of, how the heck was he going to go around Britain and collect all the honorary degrees? There was scarcely a university in Britain that didn't want to give him an honorary degree. So I think it was 8 universities in the end gave him an honorary degree at Buckingham Palace. He came to Cambridge in a slightly different light and was given an honorary fellowship at Magdalen College by a friend of mine, John Gurdon. We were seated either side of Mandela at a college lunch. And like a lot of colleges in Cambridge, Magdalen had a very good choir. And the choir went off and rehearsed and learned a whole lot of those lilting, rhythmic South African songs and music.
Yeah.
And they started singing these songs.
Mm-hmm.
And Nelson Mandela had been sitting there, and we've been talking quietly to him about various things, could not resist it. He got up and started dancing. And we were there sort of sitting and clapping with him, and he wouldn't let us just do that. So he took us by the arm and stood us up and made us dance as well. And of course, I don't think we did this as naturally and as well as he did.
And you were in your very formal university.
Yeah, formal red gowns.
Yeah.
All the silk and all the rest of it on these because it was a formal occasion.
So what?
Somehow there was somebody there, or it got into CNN's hands and went around the world for a few minutes on the news that evening and was spotted by several of my friends around the world who had one of the best laughs they've ever had at the contrast between us sort of stick insect academics next to Mandela. But it was another example of his humanity and his warmth. Mm-hmm. I think that was it. And but underneath that, the sort of steely strength that came through somehow. So, but it influenced me by taking away an obligation to think I had to go around making loud, inspiring speeches all the time.
Yeah.
I wanted people to know what I thought would be the right thing to do, but and it was, of course, because it was an academic environment. And while there were difficulties, they were 10 times less than the difficulties that Nelson Mandela had dealt with quite effectively without being a pushy, sort of bombastic politician.
So that shaped how you exercise your leadership.
To a certain extent, yeah. I was in such a sort of different environment.
So what did you change as a result of that, Alec?
Well, I just sort of did not, as I said, I didn't want to try and lead in a strident way, which wouldn't have been appropriate anyway. So I suppose it reinforced. And if Mandela could get the huge changes accomplished the way he did it, then it was an appropriate way to learn a lot from, even to do much more easier things, but things that were social things, social persuasion, which I wasn't trained to deal with at all.
Yeah. Well, I think your opera, was another wonderful example of changing the rules of the game and bringing in this more social, engagement where people can relax and relate differently. Yeah.
No, that's very true. I'd say the only thing about my own career was that I was so sort of ill prepared for the position that you always look back and think if you observed some of these things earlier on and learned more a bit earlier on, I could have accomplished a hell of a lot more than I did accomplish. So that's another lesson to learn. I think if you're going to take on, you can train people to be leaders.
Absolutely.
A lot of people say you can't, you're either a natural leader or you're not. Yeah. I don't agree with that at all. And the worst thing to do is to think you have great leadership qualities. That's probably a flaw when you start.
And I think the point you're making is such an important point, Alec, in terms of how we need to adapt to these different cultures, in terms of how we, present ourselves, engage, which takes me to a different question. I mean, you've had such an interesting multicultural young life. I know you were born in Calcutta in India, and then your family moved to Australia, and then moved across, to the UK, and, came back to Australia. I mean, you've lived in these different parts of the world. Can you think of a moment that was really a defining moment in your own life? Perhaps a crucible, something that was really difficult along that journey? When and what was that?
In IBM, I had a successful career as a research engineer, and I became an IBM fellow. So it was a rather special position. When I was made an IBM fellow, I knew my life had changed, and it did change.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, IBM was quite an astringent place, a bit like Cambridge is actually, not an easy place.
Mm-hmm.
Anecdote I'd tell is we had a Nobel laureate, Leo Osaki, in the IBM research lab. And I remember 3 years after he got his Nobel Prize, 3 or 4 years, he was standing by the coffee cart when one of the senior technicians came up to him and said, "Leo, how are you?" And Leo said, "I'm fine." And the technician said, "And what have you done lately that's any good?" And that's sort of the astringent said, when you made an IBM fellow, there were only 1 or 2 made a year, and with a big ceremony in the Waldorf Astoria in London, the CEO was there and all the rest of the thing.
Yeah.
And your responsibilities after that were only to write to the chairman of the company once a year and tell him, it was all a man then, a woman these days recently, and tell him what you were doing, what you'd done during the year. But that's all he really wanted to know. You didn't report to anybody. You had the right to do whatever you wanted. So it was the best job in the world in many ways for a creative engineer. Mm-hmm. But somehow in the IBM environment, I couldn't sort of relax into that pure research mode. I did for 4 or 5 years. But then I saw what was happening up in East Fishkill in the semiconductor factory, and I thought they should change a few things. And so I was baited by the person in charge of it there and said, well, why don't you put your actions where your mouth is and come and work up here and help me do some of these things. Mm-hmm. And that's how it got me into more senior management.
Okay.
And I didn't really, in the end, find I wanted to do that. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So as somebody who'd been given every privilege in the company, I could do anything I wanted. It was for a 5-year period, but it really could have extended a bit beyond that. Mm-hmm. I decided that really wasn't what I wanted to do, because I wanted to get away from the business pressures, the financial pressures, and all the rest of it. Yeah. And I wanted to be a researcher again and go back. So I decided to go back to Cambridge. Mm-hmm. And I also liked the idea of trying to teach some young people some of the things I've learned. Yeah. And after a year or two, I went back. IBM tried to say, you're an IBM fellow, go back to Cambridge on your full salary, get this midlife crisis over, and then you can come back to IBM again. Yeah. And I said, look, I've loved IBM. It was a marvelous company, a very well-managed company. I'd enjoyed every minute of it, but I just wanted that freedom. And my father had said, if you travel somewhere and you want to get the true benefit of another country, you've got to pretend you're going to live in that country for the rest of your life. You can't be going there for 2 years and coming back. You've got to, and your actions have to be that of a resident of that country. And that's what we've done in America, because of what Dad had told me. That's, I think, why I got on pretty well in America, because we didn't save our money with the idea of going back to England. We led a pretty full life, and we had a good sort of American style life. Yes. When I went back to England, I said, well, I can't go back on this massive salary to England. I won't be like any of the other people in Cambridge. I can't do it. But that was a difficult decision. Okay. And it was a very difficult decision for a while. After 2 years in Cambridge, I really began to wonder, because I did cheat in some ways. I did have a letter from the CEO of IBM saying, if for any reason in the next 3 years or something, you feel you would like to return to IBM, you can return to IBM and have all the jobs that you had or whatever you had. So I was cheating a bit.
What helped you come to terms with that decision, Alec? I mean, in that transition, and especially
my research began to go quite well in Cambridge.
Okay. Well, that's
and when you're on a high with your research, and we got a machine that made slightly smaller structures than anybody had ever made before, and we were doing a few things, and that's the high in one's life. If one's been a creative engineer, it's when you slave away and build a huge new bit of equipment and you turn it on and it doesn't work because it never does. But then you start to look and find out why it doesn't work. And then you make it work.
Yes.
And then you make it work better than
Yes.
it worked. And then you make it work better than anybody else worked. And I was building these microscopes. And all of a sudden, I could see things in a way that nobody else had ever seen them before.
Okay.
And that's going into space, you know.
Absolutely.
So
Absolutely.
that's the high.
And an interesting almost coming home, you know, coming back. It's almost like you did the full circle, you know.
It's funny that I think my life is at this stage too many places to call home.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, maybe it makes us rethink where home is. But before we wrap up, I'd love to just ask a couple of more, you know, fun personal things. What is your favorite childhood memory?
Well, a real childhood memory. When I was in Sydney, having left India, my father gave me a little torch battery, a D battery, a slightly bigger one, and the bulb out of a torch and a bit of wire.
Yeah.
And he said, if you hold one end of the wire on the bottom of the battery and the end of the wire on the side of the bulb, and you put the bottom of the bulb on the top, the light goes on. And I just went to the bottom of my bed. It was my first circuit.
What
and
fun.
I knew exactly how a battery, how a torch worked at the age of 3.
That's
and
fantastic.
I remember that just going into my mind. I just adored that.
That's
It
wonderful.
was my first circuit. So then Dad helped me. So by the time I was 10, I got in trouble at boarding school because I made the crystal set inevitably. But then Dad helped me go out and buy an electronic valve and amplify the output of the crystal set. And
So he helped you.
First little radio at the age of 10 or 11.
Yeah.
They're my childhood memories. I don't know why I love that stuff so much.
Yeah. Yeah. And what is your most memorable moment in the House of Lords?
The House of Lords is quite an awing place to be in. I'm not a good politician. I suppose on a couple of occasions, we've managed to be of influence to, for example, keeping the nation's interests operating for nuclear power. Without nuclear power, we're never going to be carbon free in 2050. I don't care what the dreamers say. Nuclear power is carbon free after you've built the plant. People say, well, there's all that carbon emitted when you build the plant, but there's carbon emitted when you build a wind turbine. And a nuclear plant is equivalent to about 10,000 of the largest wind turbines you could get. We've got to balance these things. So a few things where we've persuaded the country to keep going on things like that. Then, you can speak in a few debates, you never know. But I've never taken a great big thing through Parliament. I've introduced a few amendments and got them through.
Okay.
But there are a lot of people in the Lords. It's a powerful place. To be a real star in the Lords, you've got to be a really good politician as well as an expert. Lawyers tend to rule the roost.
Okay. As very often they do. Not always, but
My mother always said you should be a lawyer, and I used to say why. And she said you're so argumentative. I said, well, I like building things rather than arguing with people, really.
Yeah. And the other question, I know you had a very close friendship actually with the Duke of Edinburgh, the late Prince Philip. What is least known about him that you truly admired?
I liked the Duke because he was very straightforward. What you see is what you get. He was a lot of fun and a fantastic sense of humor. But I think the thing I liked was he was never boring and he understood things and he listened. very interestingly. He would challenge, but he would listen. Not everybody is like that. I mean, good listener. We didn't talk about good listeners. I think Mandela was a good listener too. He would stop and listen.
Yeah.
The Duke would stop and listen.
Yes. Yes.
And that was either good or bad for you, because if he decided you were talking a bunch of rubbish, he would take out a great big pin, so to speak, and stick it right in you. He, on several occasions, said things that made you want to burst out laughing, but you'd better not. Some things that were semi-inappropriate, but they were always on target in many ways. He was a man of his generation, and a lot of that's difficult for the modern generation. He modernized himself pretty well in my mind. So I was a great admirer of the way he kept up with things. He was coming still to meetings of what's called the Smithsonian's, which is the oldest, we think, dining society for engineers, named after Smeaton, who built all the lighthouses around Britain. They're founded in 1775. Yes. And the Duke of Edinburgh was the oldest member of the Smithsonians. He had been a Smithsonian for 60 years. He came to these meetings, and we used to debate issues of entrepreneurship, or whether it was, different technologies. And he was right on the front of his chair, arguing and debating these things. Yeah. And occasionally saying things that were of his generation. And we said, well, you can't say that anymore. And he would understand that, but we're all like that. The House of Lords was forced into taking a course on interactions the other day. Yeah. One of the things that they highlighted that I think a lot of us had to learn, and I learned it up in Cambridge because I had my successor, Alison Richard, did not think it was a good idea, but because I recognized that I was bad at it, I got a series of 6 or 7 of the most senior women academics to form a little group that would come and tell me things when I was doing it wrong or what I should do. And because I recognized I was not good at understanding their point of view. Alison Richard immediately dismissed that committee, and it wouldn't have been appropriate for her to have had a committee of men, as it were. And it was right, and it was me of my age. And one thing we were taught in this course that I thought was rather useful, and that is you do not refer to women over the age of 14 as girls. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And I'd taken that on board because it had been told to me in earlier days that you did not refer to the girls in the office. Or, so. And it's adapting with the times, moving with the time. Moving with the Duke was remarkable in that he didn't fall into that trap very often. And he was still coming to our discussions at 96. Wow, that's remarkable. Yeah. Do you miss him? Yeah, I always miss him. Yeah. I used to try things out on him, and he used to try things out on me, and and be very frank about things. Yes. So when he came to Cambridge, he came to see the university, but when royals visit a county, normally the official people have to see him. And he didn't like these officials when he came to Cambridge. And on one occasion, I remember him looking at the most senior Cambridgeshire official. Oh, what's that chap? I told them, I'd come to the university. I said, well, you better not say that. So you're not going to go down very well, because this person's a very helpful person and very helpful to the university. Of course, of course. Well, so I think the Duke was, he and the Queen, quite remarkable. Yeah, totally different, and that's why they were complementary. She was all warmth and tact and everything, and he was all bright intelligence, and I think they relied on each other. Well, they had a wonderful partnership over many years, and
That's remarkable. So
I'm sure she must miss him a great deal.
I'm sure she does. I have no doubt she does. And they have their own legacy that they co-created and created independently. Just any final thoughts around the future of leadership? Any thoughts that you have around what would Nelson Mandela say to the up and coming leaders of today?
I would say to the trainers of leaders, go find people with good technical minds, more than the historically traditional ways of looking for leaders. So if you're a Harvard or a Cambridge or a Wharton or something, be proactive in finding young people with obvious technical brilliance as well as natural leadership, and teaching them the leadership, because that's what the world needs today.
Yes. Lord Alec Broers, so wonderful to have this time with you. Such a great privilege and honor to have a wonderful dinner with you and your wonderful wife, Mary. We wish you well as you travel back across the Atlantic, and safe journey back to the United Kingdom. But thank you so much for being with us, having this conversation, and I look forward to our ongoing conversations.
Well, and thank you for pulling me into these things. I'm a bit reluctant these days, so thank you. And I think it's been a conversation I've enjoyed a lot. And I like what you're doing in trying to use Mandela as an example for leadership today.
As we reflect upon our conversation with Sir Alec Broers today, I'm energized and inspired by his remarkable vulnerability, teachability, and adaptability. How many of us have the same boldness and courage to invite a group of critics, people who don't necessarily like what we do or how we do it, invite them into our inner circle and ask them for honest, candid, authentic feedback, like he did with the woman at Cambridge when he was Vice Chancellor of the university. I'm also struck by his connection between the arts and sciences, and how different this world may be if we develop our young engineers and scientists to understand more of the arts, and of course for the rest of us and who are not scientists, and for the artists, how much better would this world be if we too immersed ourselves and learned more about the sciences. Climate change is such an overwhelming challenge for all of us, and this presents a whole new different opportunity. It was Albert Einstein who once said that the arts and science are branches on the same tree, and all great scientists are all great artists too. We know that bold leadership is about making thoughtful, clear choices, and leading boldly is about taking bold action, just one small step at a time. One small step for you, but together, one giant step for humanity. So until next time, take care and take bold action.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Leading Boldly into the Future. Please find links and connections mentioned in this show in our blog, and never miss an episode by subscribing at anne-pratt.com. That's ANNE-PRATT.com. May these insights from inspiring industry leaders, remarkable disruptors, and courageous champions of change bring forth a brand new you, emboldened, empowered, and ready to inspire hope. Come back soon, share with your friends, sign up on anne-pratt.com and join our movement for change. Why? Because the world needs you to lead boldly too.